Now, it is my great honor to introduce John. So for many years, today's guest was an important part of nearly every Tulsan's morning as a cup of coffee and a morning commute. And even though I wasn't here all that time, I still listened to John Erling even over as far as I could get him in western Oklahoma. For as the Oklahoma Broadcasters Association put it in announcing his induction into its Hall of Fame, he's Tulsa's #1 all-time radio personality, without a doubt, right? You guys all know him. That organization also noted he helped raise more than $1 million for community causes through the years. He also has the rare distinction of being honored into induction into the Oklahoma Historians Hall of Fame. The executive director of the Oklahoma Historic Society noted at that time that our speakers' oral histories on voicesofoklahoma.com have added to the state's historical record, with historians and the general public having access to those interviews to understand and share the past. That number of interviews is now nearly 300, as the Voices of Oklahoma celebrates its 15th anniversary this month with the publication of the 3rd volume of Voices of Oklahoma. So those of you who still take the Tulsa World, don't laugh because I love reading the Tulsa World. I like holding the paper. John's book was there Friday. Great story about his interviews with the Killers of the Flower Moon people. And he has, these are book series. There's 3 volumes. Each volume covers, and by the way, great Father's Day. That's what I'm going to get my son for Father's Day, is all 3 volumes, because he speaks to people from Oklahoma. And John says, as a forward, wrote Erling in the forward, for the past 15 years, we've been collecting stories, Oklahoma stories, and placing them on a website and placing them in a podcast, easily available for reading and listening. We're learning about the struggles, challenges, and the victories of the people of our state. Many of them have improved our lives, and because of their determination and grit, as a result, we're living better lives. So in listening, we're also honoring. It is my great pleasure to introduce the man who woke Tulsa up on KRMG for over 30 years, and the founder and the voice of Voices of Oklahoma, John Erling.
Thank you. Appreciate that very much. It's also nice to be invited back to a place that you've already spoken to. Good to see you. Thank you very, very much. It was radio that brought me to Tulsa in 1976. And if any of you were listening to radio, to KRMG stands for Kerr McGee, by the way. If any of you were listening to the radio station then, you would have heard this.
Do you see mountains around here?
You know, I don't believe you at all. Because we come down here and we stayed here at the motel, or the boys did, and then they tell me they called the Chamber of Commerce, and the people at the motel didn't know anything about it, and then they called somebody else, and they were on the radio, and they didn't necessarily want on the radio, and they found out it was a big joke. Now, is it a joke or isn't it a joke?
Then a Jackson Hole miss with a Teton kiss, say, let's get Tulsa Mountain High.
Well, all I'm asking you, have you seen the Tulsa Mountains?
The Tulsa Mountains.
Well, where's the lodge at? Now, those boys made a trip down here and back for nothing. Where's the lodge at?
You see, if you've never seen the Tulsa Mountains, then there aren't any lodges.
I think there's something wrong with you. I really do. You got a problem, and I think you should get some help.
You mean a psychiatrist?
One thing
That was hang up number 17, I think.
while he didn't get the concept of what I was doing, one thing he did get right when he said, I think you need to get some help. And I've sought help all these years, and it has not paid off yet. It was 15 years ago, in fact, this month, that we launched our oral history website, voicesofoklahoma.com. I've interviewed nearly 300 people, which developed into 34 different topics. Over 118 people have died, which prompts George Kaiser to say, I ain't going to be interviewed by you. But then he told me 2 people he wanted me to interview. And that'll have to remain off the record. One sudden death, there have been several who have died. Oral Roberts died 4 months after I interviewed him. That was one. But the most dramatic was Marion Opala. He was one of our Supreme Court justices. In fact, he was Chief Justice at one time. It's a great story. And I interviewed him in the chambers of the justices, and he was looking forward to his 90th birthday. Wonderful story, great accent, came out of Poland, worked for the British during the war, and he died 4 days later. But we have his voice. We have his voice. So I'm going to emphasize that a lot because I want you to be recording your stories for your family. That's why I do this. I do it to preserve, but I come out to speak so that I can plant the seed for you to do the same. So how did this all start? For a period of maybe about 10 years, Walt Helmerich and I were friends, and once a month we'd have lunch. I don't know what this oil man had wanted to do with me, a North Dakota farm boy, but he enjoyed radio and he enjoyed listening to KRMG. So he told me all these great stories. So I said, well, I shouldn't be the only man beyond your family that knows these stories. Let's record you and put it on a website, gear it to education and students, and he was for that. So then I said, well, then would you get your friend Henry Zero? And he did, and so we recorded Henry Zero, and those were the 2 first foundations that contributed to this project. Now, the first interview that we put on the website was that of Wilma Mankiller. And you know, she was the first female chief of the Cherokee Nation. What a wonderful, wonderful woman. And I want you to hear this part because the federal government had this relocation program. They wanted to take Native Americans out of where they lived, put them in Milwaukee, Chicago, wherever, I suppose, to remove the culture from them and become like us. So whatever us is. And so they didn't have to go, but the government promised them a better life. So here's Wilma talking about what happened to her and her family.
What the federal government would do to entice people to participate in the relocation program was promise them a better life for the children, an education, a job for the adults. So it was called the Relocation and Employment Training Program. They would relocate people from places like our community and rural Navajo Nation and other places like that to Chicago or Los Angeles or Denver or Phoenix or San Francisco, places like that. Our better life, our first night in San Francisco was at an old hotel in San Francisco in the Tenderloin district, which is the red light district of San Francisco. If you try to think of getting on a train in rural Adair County in the late 1950s, it was like landing in Mars. And my mom, who's not Cherokee, was still a very rural person. And so the whole thing was as bewildering to her as it was to the children or the other families that participated in the program. But the better life for my family ended up with my father and my older brother getting a back-breaking job at a rope factory. And our family eventually ended up in a very rough housing project called Hunters Point in San Francisco. And so the better life that a lot of people were promised didn't turn out that way at all.
Did not at all.
Misguided federal policy.
Yeah. Yeah. Fortunately, obviously, she came back to Oklahoma and became a wonderful activist. I interviewed her husband, Charlie Soap, and he talks about a wonderful project known as the Bell Water Project, where they brought water to Bell, Oklahoma. That in itself is a wonderful story. And I could preach to you about this for the next 2 hours, but we have to stop and let David Emery preach to us, so I got to stop, okay? Wilma's face is on our quarters, and also the Barbie doll people. They use her likeness on Barbie dolls. That's how important she became. So a lot of this just gets to be grunge hard work, but I've traveled to New Mexico for Senator Fred Harris, Santa Fe, New Mexico for N. Scott Momaday, the wonderful artist and poet, Nacogdoches, Texas for the grandson of Thomas Gilcrease, went to Dallas for T. Boone Pickens, went to California for Oral Roberts, Washington, D.C. for former Congressman Jim Jones, who represented this district for many years. Most of the interviews I do in person, but this whole thing has been a gift to me because I get to be in front of all these people that I would have never gotten in front of. They welcome me into their homes, into their boardrooms, many different places, and some of them come to my house to record. Some of them I do on the phone, but it's been a wonderful experience for me. Recently, I call him the father of our community, Robert LaFortune. I just talked to his daughter when coming in here this morning. Robert LaFortune was such a wonderful man. He has such a humility about him and such a sound sense of judgment. And so I want you to listen to Bob. And he talks about the Williams Tower and the Performing Arts Center and how he worked together with his good friend John Williams. And those kind of bonds helped, and as we know, actually changed Boston Avenue because they had to block that off.
However, when the Williams Company decided that they wanted to build a new building, they were in the present NBT building on Boston. They were growing very fast and needed a lot of office space. They hired an architect, Yamura Yamasaki from Detroit, to come in and design a Williams Center office complex. Since we had our kind of foot in the door with Joe Williams, he knew that we needed a theater. And so, in talking with his brother John, they kind of settled on that perhaps a theater could go in the new Williams complex. So they picked out the corner where the Hotel Tulsa had been, the half block just off of Cincinnati and north of 3rd Street. They designated that as a potential site for a theater. John had, in his work with Yamasaki, very ingeniously converted what was a 2-tower project of Yamasaki's for the Williams Company to a 1-story tower. Yamasaki had presented 2 towers of about 25 or 30 stories each, and John suggested he put one on top of the other and just make it bigger. The building that Yamasaki developed was very similar to the World Trade Center towers that went down 9/11. At any rate, John saw the potential of the theater site, so he approached Lita Chapman to make a major league gift for a theater. She consented. She agreed that she would give $3.5 million. He then called me in for a meeting and he said, Bob, if we could go half and half, public-private, on a $14 million budget, I'll raise $7 million privately, half of which is already assured through Mrs. Chapman. If the city could put up $7 million, we'd have enough to build this theater for $14 million. That's how we got started with the theater.
And that's how they got started. They eventually had to raise more money to make that happen. But that's a great story of these two people working together. And there was something about Bob, was that humility I talk about. When I asked him, how do you want to be remembered? He just said, as good old Bob. There are people who will wax eloquently about themselves who are not as nearly as great as Bob. So back to Walt Helmrich. You may or may not know that he was kidnapped and his family wouldn't pay the ransom. No, I'm just kidding about that. So something happened to Walt when he was on the way to work one day.
In June of 1974, something happened to you. That morning, you left for work.
I always went the same way every morning down St. Louis to Utica Square area. Going down the street, this guy half a block ahead jumps out in the street with a stop sign, and he's got an orange jacket and a hard hat, just standing right in the middle of the street waving the sign. So I pull up to him and stop. He comes around to my window, and one of the things I'll never forget, he had a Band-Aid over his top lip and another one on his lower lip, just a Band-Aid. He said, "There's a gas leak ahead, and you've got to stop until it clears." I said, "Okay." So I leaned over to turn off the ignition key, and I felt this cold gun in the back of my... He said, "Now do what I tell you, or I'm going to kill you." I said, "Well, look, I'll give you everything I have." He said, "No, that isn't what I want. Just get over in the passenger seat." And I kind of climbed over there, and I said, "Do you know how to drive a Mercedes?" He said, "Yes, I can handle it, Father." So we go driving on. He said, "Keep your head down between your knees. I don't want you looking up. I don't want you looking at me." So we drive, and I didn't know it, but it was that underground parking we have there on the south side of Utica Square where the doctors parked. He must have gone way back in the corner and said, "Now get out." And he put me in another car.
So to get the rest of that story, you're going to have to go to voicesofoklahoma.com. Walt was a great storyteller, and he revealed his sense of humor there, even under stress. That's, I think, one of the reasons we got along together, because we had that same sense of humor. So then I asked him to get his friend Henry Zero. And I didn't know I was going to get these answers from Henry. And that's what's kind of fun. You never know what these people are going to tell you. So here's Henry.
I was only about 13, and my loan officer was a fellow named Roscoe Adams. He was a bachelor, and they lived at the Tulsa Hotel. So I went up there at nighttime and was asking him, "I'd like to borrow $300. He said, "Well, you're too young, son." I said, "Yes, I know it, but I'll sure try to hope I'd pay. I owe some bills for groceries for my store." J. Paul Getty was sitting next to him, and he heard me talking. He said, "Well, why don't you loan the boy some money and help him get started?" So Roscoe Adams go ahead and write the checks.
Isn't that something? And it's so great that we have his voice telling that story. And then Henry said, J. Paul Getty set him up in a beautiful hotel with a credit card. And Henry said, "I didn't know what to do, go to New York and be in a fancy hotel." So he didn't do that. Because I think I have some time here, I got to tell you a great story about Walt and Henry. As I said, they were very, very good friends. Walt and his wife Peggy were strong supporters of several churches in town, and First Presbyterian was one of them. And they were having a Capitol drive, and at lunch, because Henry and Walt lunched about once a week, and Walt says to him, "I'm going to give $1 million to that project at First Presbyterian." And he said, "Will you, Henry, do the same?" And Henry said, "Yes, I will." So here's Walt now. He says to him, "Well, Henry, why would you, a Jew, give to a Protestant church?" And Henry says, "Because I love you, Walt." Isn't that great? I've interviewed many women leaders. In addition to Wilma Mankiller, Dale McNamara, she started the TU Golf program. Unfortunately, she is not with us. Becky Dixon, Wide World of Sports, she's a pioneer woman. That's a great story. Betty Boyd of Channel 8, she went on to our state legislature. Carrie Dickerson, she opposed Black Fox nuclear plant. Norma Eagleton, first woman elected to the Tulsa City Commission, first woman elected to the Oklahoma Corporation Commission. Nancy McDonald recently passed. She was a volunteer, did so many wonderful things, and interviewed federal judge Stephanie Seymour. Wonderful, wonderful women. So what have I learned over 15 years? of doing this. It's kind of like I'm a drone looking down on all these lives that we have here, the zigs and zags of life. Some will give credit to God, and some will give it to credit to chance, probably not relating it to God. I see it as God. I've been reading the book by Salman Rushdie, and he wrote Satanic Verses, and then they put out a death note on him for many, many years by the leader of Iran. When he's just recently read a book on knife, when he was knifed 15 times when he was performing in Chautauqua, New York. And this sentence stood out at me: chance determines our fate as much as profoundly, at least as profoundly as choice. So let me say that again. Chance determines our fates at least as profoundly as choice. So I thought, well, I'm telling this story. That's kind of what I'm trying to say. Some things just happen, the flip of a coin. So now I'm down to the two words, chance and choice. And I want to demonstrate that. Here's an example of chance. Bert Holmes accidentally saw Chester Cadjo. And in that instant, something very, very special happened. And this was definitely by choice, or by chance.
When did you meet Chester Cadjo?
Well, as far as Quick Trip's concerned, in 1957. However, I had gone to junior high school with Chester at Wilson Junior High School. He went down to Central, I went to Rogers. We didn't see each other until after we both had graduated from college. We met at a wedding. I got to know him then. He was in the Air Force at the time, and he came back and went to work. Trying to sell printing, wasn't very good at it. I was standing in front of the Phil Tower building one May afternoon. I saw Chester coming down the street, and of course he was only about 5'6", and I looked down at him and said, "You look awful, Chester." He said, "Well, Holmes, you don't look much better yourself." I said, "Well, let me tell you my problem." So I took him inside. There was a place called the Tower Grill at that time, and had great malts. I bought him a malt and told him that I had this idea. I'd been down to Dallas and seen the 7-Eleven stores, and I thought there needed to be some up here. And I tried to do a deal with a guy for a year, a guy named Harry Burt, whose dad used to own Burt's Good Humor Ice Cream Company here in town. I never could get it done with him.
Okay, you asked the ice cream man. You wanted him to get in the convenience business with you?
I wanted him to be what ended up being the Chester, and he did not want to do that or couldn't. So I went on and signed a letter agreement for a lease, and then I ran into Chester, and I told him, I said, "Chester, this is what I'm doing." I said, "A friend of mine at the bank across the street's going to loan me $5,000. I've got 3 guys who want to put up $2,000 apiece, and I'm looking for someone who put up $5,000, and I'll let him run the company." Chester said, "I hate what I'm doing. I might like to do that." I said, "Well, look, I'm leaving town for a week. When I come back, I'll check with you." He said, "Well, I'll talk to my dad and see what he said." He came back, his dad told him he'd loan him $5,000, and that's how it got started. It was about that simple.
If you hadn't seen Chester on that day you talk about, was he on a list of people to call? Would you have called him?
No.
Wow. So that just shows how, on a whim, Quick Trip took off.
Absolutely fortuitous for him and for me, yeah.
Isn't that amazing? So that's an example of chance. So I'm talking about this, you think about your own life when it was chance and choice that happened to maybe change the trajectory of your life. Here's another chance story. John Hausum, the real estate person, he told me this story about when he was in the Korean War. He was a master sergeant, and he was walking down this path with his first lieutenant. By chance, he stepped off the path. His squad leader, leading the squad behind, continued on the path. Squad leader stepped on a bomb and blew him up. And here's John over here, obviously sitting down and shaken, and said, "It's a rare day that I never said to me, I can't believe that I'm here doing what I'm doing." That was by chance. So then we have an example of choice. Peter Mayo, it was his uncles who built the Mayo Hotel and the Mayo Building downtown, and they were in the furniture business in that Mayo Building. Peter now owns the old lady on Brady, as I call it still. It's called the Tulsa Theater. And Peter made a choice with his parents about that building.
I just want to emphasize how you saved the building from demolition. Right. If you hadn't bought it from the city of Tulsa, they were considering demolishing it.
Well, there were two dairy companies at that point in time that were right across the street from Tulsa Theater. Literally right across Brady to the south, and to the west there was Carnation. Large dairies. So you had an industrial element going on where that had taken over the neighbor. You had warehouses and you had some light industry going on. There was no recreation, there were no bar, etc., no restaurant, none of that. Right. So the city, I believe, and I'm speculating here, that they were thinking, well, no one's going to buy this place and revive it as a theater. So these dairy companies will probably take it over, either tear it down or whatever, and use it for some industrial purpose. And that was the thinking, yes. And most of the people I knew thought, why are you buying that place?
So I'm trying to emphasize again, you saved this building from demolition.
Well, thank you.
And preserved it as a historical piece for Tulsans forever and ever, and $35,000.
Right, which is a fraction of what it cost once we got in there.
Right, because then you got in and you put many, many dollars.
Do you want the full story on the 35?
Yes.
Okay, so in 1977, Oral Roberts went on a promotional campaign for donations. He'd go on TV, he'd go on the radio, and he'd say, we're building the City of Faith Hospital. And, it's a miracle that this happened, and in a vision, I was told that I could only accept donations in increments of 7. So, if you send some money in to help me get this City of Faith built, it needs to be either 7 cents or 77 cents or $77,777 or whatever. So my mother and my father had a sense of humor about these kinds of things. And when we put the bid in, we put it in for $37,777.77 as a tribute to Oral. My dad knew Oral Roberts.
Oh, okay.
Sure he did. My dad knew all those guys.
Mm-hmm.
They were friends. And they would chuckle about stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, yeah.
Peter is a musician, and he's a sound engineer in buildings and all that. And he played the piano. I did it in his studio, and he played the piano as I did the interview. It's a great interview. I really enjoyed Peter Mayo. Those who are born with an artistic ability of painting or music, it generally surfaces when you're 3 or 4 years old. You don't automatically start singing when you're 65. But you do if you have that ability when you're that young. Charles Banks Wilson, he painted the 4 murals in the Capitol and other people there from life. And he told me how he'd get under his mother's table to draw so she wouldn't see it. He needed something to draw, and so he drew under that. And he was a great interview for sure. And he actually drew Will Rogers in Veneta while Will Rogers was on stage, and Charles Banks. And Will said to him, why don't you go home and get all your stuff together and come back and you can draw me while I'm performing here. And so Charles Banks Wilson tells that story. Now, our storytellers also have pointed out how teachers make a difference. And I hope that's not new knowledge to any of you, because they do, and right now they're under a glare in our world of education. Teachers make a difference. Bart Connors, the gold gymnastics Olympic star, he told me in his interview that he was always interested in tumbling, as they called it then. And his teacher said, if you'll ask your mother if I can take you and your brother to this big gymnasium on a Saturday, I will do that for you. And Bart says, as I walked in, I could smell the smell and I just knew this is where I belonged. And it was the teacher who did that and became that great Olympic star. By the way, so I'm talking about these things, when we see things in children, whether it's artwork or music, we need to encourage them to say, hey, you're good. That's all I did. A kid likes to have it. So we need to compliment them. One of my latest interviews qualifies for early discovery of talent and a teacher that makes a difference. Her name is Leona Mitchell, and I'm sure you know of her. She was born in Enid, lives there today. She grew up in her father's church, singing gospel music, secular music, but no opera in the Baptist church. Leona was singing with her siblings, the musical Mitchells, and they were traveling in Oklahoma, singing in all these churches. So that's her background. It was while attending Enid High School that this experience took place.
I call her my other mother. That was Miss Maureen Prevey. She was the choir director in high school, the Enid High School. And she had wanted to sing opera, and she had gone to New York and studied and everything. And because her mother didn't want her to leave Oklahoma, she came back from New York and became a school teacher.
So then she introduced you to opera?
Yes, she did.
Did she show you something?
Oh, she had me listen. I'll tell you how that happened. I was in choir and just singing, I was singing the lower voice. And that girl that I'm talking about that went through junior high, she was sitting next to me as a mezzo, what I guess you call altos. And so I could hum along and sing these high notes, and I would hum under my breath while the sopranos were singing. So she couldn't get these sopranos to do this really high note. And so the girl next to me, Marilyn, said, Leona can do it. I could have killed her. I went, what? And so that began, she heard me and she heard my voice. And she went, and you know what? I listened later, John. She made some 78s, and I listened to one of her opera arias that I became famous for, and our voices were really similar.
Oh, really? I think if you had not been introduced by her to opera,
no, I would never have done it.
Because your life
I was in gospel, and I was not doing that at all. When I first heard opera, John, I went, oh my God, they sing like that? Oh, I wonder if I can, I get chills, yeah.
So teachers make a difference. We can make a difference too when we spot it in them. She was sitting in my home recording this, and I asked her near the end if there's something that maybe she'd like to sing. So this is not a major recording, but I thought.
Can I have you just do a little phrase of a song? Could be
anything.
Anything,
okay,
right?
Just anything.
Just
okay.
Give us something.
Okay, I'm gonna do that. Oh Lord, my God, when I in awesome wonder consider all the worlds thy hands have made, then sings my soul, my Savior God, to thee. How great thou art, how great thou art.
Amen and hallelujah. And I think I'll walk down the sawdust trail and come to the altar. You've seen that before. I know you have.
Yeah.
That was wonderful.
Now, to be an opera singer, you have to have a really strong voice because you're singing in huge venues and they don't use microphones at all. And she's about 5'2", 5'3". And that voice, when that comes out of her, I had met her before in Quartz Mountain. There was a symposium we'd go to all the time, and she was asked to sing there. And I didn't know this. It was probably 20-some years ago. When she sang, I just went up to you. I said, you have a God-given voice. I didn't realize I was talking to somebody who believed in God and Jesus Christ. She could have said, yeah, I know. Now, some of these interviews, some broke rules, and they changed the world. Marilyn Looper is a daughter of Clara Looper, educator and activist in Oklahoma City. And so Clara organized several children to sit in on lunch counter sit-ins. And that whole demonstration actually began in Oklahoma City and spread through other parts of the country. So here is Maryland. It's hard to believe that we lived in that era when things were like this, that the kids went in and she said all they wanted was a Coke and a hamburger. That's all they wanted.
You had a chimpanzee thrown on you, and that, of course, frightened you.
Yes.
And as a small girl, I don't know how big the chimpanzee was, probably almost as big as you.
He threw it right on me. As we used to say, if it doesn't kill you, it make you stronger. Because during the city movement, as it progressed, and the bitterness progressed, people spitting on you, dropping coffee, kicking you, whatever, you learned that we were part of this army of nonviolence, no matter what. And the people that could not remain nonviolent, they were asked not to come back. We could not afford to let them ruin the mission. We wanted to be able to go in and sit down and drink that Coke and eat that hamburger.
So that first evening, you stayed till they closed. Is that true?
Basically.
Because they didn't relent. And then wasn't it the second day they finally said, all right?
No, it wasn't the second day. It took a little bit longer.
Then they did finally serve you.
As a matter of fact, when Cat's Drug Store opened its doors to all people, and this is a story that most people don't realize, not only did they open their doors here, but across the country they opened their doors to people of all races, creeds, and colors.
So it all started here, and then they went to South Carolina and other places where lunch counters, and then Katz opened it up to all their stores because of what Clara Looper started, and her daughter Marilyn did the same thing. Many things are lost to the past, and we're trying not to let that happen to all historians, and in particular since I'm talking about Voices of Oklahoma. Now we have a friend here in the audience. I call him the Miracle Man. His name is Herb Lipe. Is he here anywhere in the audience today? 100 years old. We're fortunate that we got to meet him here. Most of Tulsa haven't met him, but he's a doctor and optometrist for many, many years, 50 years. So it was an obvious interview for me. Richard is here because he was involved in the centenarian work. In fact, you helped me on a couple of centenarians and interviews. So I want you to listen to Herb in this segment. And that mind of his at 100 is sharper than probably most of us that are in this room. And Herb talks about the war days and World War II.
Your parents politically involved, so like FDR, did they like him? He was a Democrat or, Republican?
Well, my dad was Democrat, my mom was a Republican. He was like all presidents, if and a little bit pro, a little bit con. Looking back on, I probably have some qualms with that, with him, but he served in a time that was a very difficult time, and he did some good things, like he did the Lend-Lease program with Britain. In 1939, they were being attacked by Hitler. All of Europe was, and especially Great Britain. And Great Britain was, across the channel. So Hitler decided he was going to go ahead and attack, Great Britain. So he was taking an awful beating in the air because they had the Spitfire, a most wonderful fighter plane, and they were shooting down a lot of the bombers that Hitler was sending over. So Hitler couldn't really, finally though, he called off the invasion of Great Britain, and it was a good thing because the Brits had been making Spitfire planes as fast as they were losing too, as well as the Germans, but they were shooting down the German planes like crazy. And so they called it Battle of Britain. I believe Hitler called it off then, and they did try to invade across the channel. And it's probably good they didn't, but the Brits were running out of Spitfire planes too to fight them. Also part of history, yeah.
Yes, and you've got such a great memory to remember all that.
I just admire you, Herb, grasp all that. I think I'd have to read a history book before I could do that, but you did that right off the top of your head. but I want to follow up because I asked him a question about his memory.
You have shared many interesting details today. So your memory at 100, how would you describe your memory?
Well, I don't really have an answer for that, John. This is something you might or might not know. At the time, Coca-Cola had about a 6.7 or 6.9 ounce Coca-Cola. Well, here comes Pepsi-Cola, and they had 12 ounces, so they had this little ditty on the radio, and that Pepsi-Cola hits the spot. And 12 full ounces, that's a lot. Twice as much for a nickel, too. Pepsi-Cola is a drink for you. And of course it was twice as big as a Coca-Cola, a little bit different taste, but, and then they had another brand, Royal Crown Cola, they called it RC Cola. It was also big, it's never on the market. So some, probably Coke or Dr. Pepper or Pepsi or someone bought them out, probably you never see them anymore. Yeah, that was a little ditty that was, I always remembered it.
Herb, we all want to be like you. If we can be as healthy as you and clear of mind, I want to be there. And I only have 3 years to, no, more than in honor of our 15th anniversary, we've published volume 3. And this is segments of the interview, and then it tells you to go to the website. And they're on Amazon. Go to Voices of Oklahoma. It'll come up, volume 3, volume 2, volume 1. And it's only $14.99, and you can buy them there. It's on demand. And I encourage you, even if you didn't listen to our website or go anything, if you read this, I know you'd have interesting time through it. I read a lot of books at night, just a little bit at a time. This would be a great, read a story and go to sleep, okay? So my call to action here is for you to record your family stories, because generations to come are going to want to hear your voice, but the stories that are handed down. I am the grandson of 4 Norwegian immigrants. On the maternal grandparents came and settled in Minnesota, paternal in North Dakota, south of Grand Forks, North Dakota. That's where I grew up. My grandfather homesteaded in 1894. He brought his wife, Ingeborg, to live there. Government gave him 160 acres. And my dad would tell stories about this, how his dad built a dugout, built a log cabin, 2 frame homes. One was taken in a storm, one was taken by fire. Now, it would be fun to hear him tell that story, wouldn't it? Well, my dad died in 1991, and he was 88 years old. And for some reason, I was not in the oral history business. I recorded him talking about this story. Now, here he is with his Scandinavian accent. His mother did not speak English at all, because in that area, they were all Norwegians. All her lady friends were Norwegians. She belonged to East Wally Lutheran Church, and all the activities there were conducted in Norwegian. So when my dad and his brothers and sisters learned English in school, they'd come home and speak Norwegian. So he had this Norwegian accent. And so we have the story. We talk about fact-checking. This is it right here about my father.
Well, my father came across alone before he was married. He came across on the boat. And then he came to Grand Forks. And then he went south to Grand Forks, 13 miles. And here he made application for land there. He had to live on the place 6 months of a year. So he stayed there during the summer, and then the fall come, then he went back to Norway. Then the next spring he came back again, and he built the house. There was all prairie around there, and here comes the prairie fire and burned the house down. The next fall he went back to Norway again. Come back and he built the second house. And the tornado took that one. Then he put up a log house. And that stayed. That stayed until they tore it down when they built the other house.
So I have the sound of his voice as long as I live, and our children and grandchildren will have it as well. And not only the sound of the voice, but that great immigrant story. In time, when your loved ones die, you will forget the sound of their voice. I have forgotten the sound of my mother's voice, but you will forget it, and those follow you will forget your voice. So, in addition to the millions you'll be leaving to them, why not leave something priceless? And that would be the sound of your voice and the stories of their family. When you record, and by the way, you can just take a regular smartphone and you can push the record button and sit there and you just start talking. You can either do it by yourself or have somebody around to ask you questions. You do a half hour or whatever, come back and do it again. But the point is that you just need to do it. I could be like Billy Graham right now. All those who will do this signify by saying aye. When you record, also include current events. When the day President Kennedy was assassinated, what did you feel? Where were you? What you did? So that's part of your story. 9/11, the Oklahoma City bombing, where were you? They'll say, well, where were you? They want to know that. The Korean War and all that. You should share that with them. Okay, I'm going to play something here, but I will warn you ahead of time, I don't have time for the whole thing. Our state song was not Oklahoma all the time, but it was Oklahoma Toast. So, of course, I have interviewed George Nye, who's 95, 97 years old and still gets about, drives his own car. It's amazing where he is. And so here's George talking about our state song.
In '53, Oklahoma had its state song, Oklahoma a Toast. You, as a young legislator, didn't feel that song was good enough.
I wanted the image of Oklahoma to be like the stage play. I was teaching Oklahoma history. Everybody sang Oklahoma wherever you went. 50 foreign countries, Oklahoma was produced on stage. I introduced this bill to change it. I thought, piece of cake. A guy I call Old Man Huff also taught Oklahoma history over in Ada. He started hollering and screaming and preaching. I can't believe you're going to change this song that was written by pioneers steeped in tradition and couched in history to a play written by two New York Jews who've never even been to Oklahoma. They say taters and tomatoes. He says, this is our song, and starts walking on the floor singing, Oklahoma, Oklahoma. He gets legislators by the arm and makes them stand. He starts crying. And it ends, but I have not told the half, so I give you Oklahoma. It's a toast we all can quaff. I looked around, and I saw that bill going down the toilet.
Toilet?
So I asked for unanimous consent to postpone for one legislative day. I got on the phone. First, I got the state representative from Chickasha. The college there used to be a college for women, OCW, Oklahoma College for Women. Naturally, their chorus was all girls. And I said, can they sing Oklahoma? And he said, yeah, we just did that production. I said, I want your girls' choir up here tomorrow. Then I got on the phone and called Ridge Bond, who then lived in Tulsa, Oklahoma, the only Oklahoman to star as Curly on Broadway. Ridge Bond was in high school with my brothers, so I knew Ridge Bond from McAllister. I said, you still got those Oklahoma costumes? He said, oh yeah. And I said, I want you down here tomorrow. There was Jenkins Music Company in Oklahoma City, so I called him and I said, I need a piano. The next day, I get up on the floor of the legislature and I said, Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that privileges of the floor be given to the girls' chorus from Oklahoma College for Women and Mr. Ridge Bond of Tulsa, Oklahoma. The girls' chorus came in and they sang, oh, what a beautiful morning. They sang, people will say we're in love. Suddenly, the piano player started the boom, 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 boom. Rich Bond, in his curly outfit, kicked open the doors with his cowboy boots, came in, and he started singing, "Oh, Oklahoma." The legislator stood and applauded. The entire crowd in the gallery, all 200 of them, stood. Of course, I had put them up there. I'd gotten all the secretaries to come in. The whole crowd sang Oklahoma. When he ended Oklahoma, okay, yeah. Then I said, "Mr. Speaker, I move approval of House Bill 1042 to make Oklahoma the state song," and it passed.
Oklahoma. Right. Isn't that a great story? It took him longer to tell that story. I shortened it up, but to hear the whole thing, it's fun to hear that. Now, I don't know if you know that, but God used oral history for the Bible. And they say that oral history stories were transmitted down to generations before actually being written into a text. Stories were handed down orally. The Apostle Luke, in Luke and Acts, relied on oral history and written history. And they say that Luke may have conducted interviews with eyewitnesses of Jesus' ministry. In Luke chapter 1, verses 1 through 4, the opening statement is this. Luke mentions eyewitnesses and servants of the word. And so we believe that he used oral history as well. So when people talk to me about this project, and I'm happy to tell them about it, and I tell them, so I am doing the Lord's work. And I thank you for this invitation to be here.